All right. So, Joe, thanks for being with me to talk
Of
about
course.
Intoxication of the Ulsterman. One of our favorites. Not an often discussed tale, I think.
No, I think by and large this tale, while talked about, it has not attracted the attention of scholars in a serious way, partially because it is so unusual.
So, I mean, yeah, why don't we get into that? What what would you say are some of the most unusual features of this story?
I think the most notable unusual fact is Cuchulainn's wild ride through Ireland, right? He's trying to get from point A to point B, both of which are quite close in the grand scheme of things, but he finds himself going hither and yonder all over the place.
Yeah, it's a real inversion of his normal ability to find his way anywhere, even if he's never been there before. So, as I discussed in the plot summary, right, we have two versions. They leave off the beginning leaves off, and then the second one picks up more or less but not perfectly where it leaves off, and then these are fitted together when we get translations. But there's an interesting change, which is, well, first off, Fergus is not present in either the beginning or the end, the two different versions that we have. And then Maeve, who is actually not doesn't play that active a role in the part that she's in, but she disappears completely from the conclusion. But Alil is still there, and Alil basically never has an independent existence from Maeve. He's an appendage of her, practically. So that's interesting. Also unusual because Conchobar is not king of all of Ulster.
Yeah, this is odd because we have Cuchulainn, whose age is unclear within this text. It's not sure whether we should be envisioning him in his youth, right, or maybe even in older when he should be expected to serve as king. But we almost have like a tripartite setup. We have Conchobar being middle-aged, Cuchulainn being a young king, and then Fintan himself being old. Kind of a grandfather figure amongst them.
Yeah, he's the father of Kethern, who shows up as also a fairly older warrior in the Twine. So yeah, he's at least two generations above Cuchulainn, you'd think. So that's definitely an interesting part of it. I do think like the division of Ulster is sort of an interesting. You have in other stories, there's the king Ogun MacDurthacht, right, who's sort of a rebellious under-king. He's one of the Ulster kings, but he sometimes kind of breaks away from Conchobar's authority, and Conchobar has to bring him back in line. And that plays into the exile of the sons of Ishlu, the death of the sons of Ishlu, since he's the one who, to prove his loyalty to Conchobar, kills them. He's absent from this. He's not mentioned at all. Sorry, we may have some cat presence on the audio, but in our laps. So that's sort of interesting. The whole tale starts with a description of how Ireland itself is divided in two between the Gaels, the sons of Miel, and the Tuatha Dé Danann. That the Tuatha Dé Danann go underground. They're permitted to stay in Ireland, but only in the other world that you access through the ground. So that there's already this division, this twofold division of Ireland, and then a threefold division of Ulster. So thematically, it works. And again, and this is, I forget where else it's mentioned that the Tuatha Dé Danann leave behind these unseen instigators to stir up strife and conflict. And there's plenty of tales where that happens. But it's made explicit. They're there to kind of impose division on their successors as rulers of Ireland. A lot of really interesting stuff. Stuff that doesn't, like you said, the timeline of this is very hard to pin down. The sons of Ishlu are still alive. In this tale, they act as surety.
But they don't otherwise have much agency, if any, at all within the text. They're just it's almost as if the scribe or the author is just inserting their presence as a reference, more than any substance.
Yeah, I mean, and I think they do. I think they are described. Yes, they are described arriving at Tavar Luachra. at the fortress that the conflict eventually happens at. They're part of the assembly of the Ulstermen, the wild chariot ride of the Ulstermen. They're part of it. So it has to be before they're killed, but also Fergus would absolutely be among the Ulstermen at that point. It's before his exile, but he's not. He's mentioned in the tale, but he's not present. Yeah. Conall Cernach is not present. No, Conall Cernach is present in the tale. Okay.
And he's mentioned. I mean, the juxtaposition between him and Cuchulainn, I think, is a key part of setting up Cuchulainn's kingship to some extent.
Yeah.
That's why Cuchulainn's role is odd in this. He's acting in a capacity he doesn't otherwise appear within the rest of the altar cycle in this kingship. His age is unclear. The timeline is unclear, and we have a blending of different social units, right? Like towards the end of the text, the relationship between the Connachta and the Ulad does not resolve in the same way that it does in other tales which highlight their conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, Maeve and Alil and how they relate to the Ulstermen, because there's like in Bricriu's Feast, for instance, they have they're sort of appealed to as a third party, neutral, but not hostile other kingdom. Like they can mediate this dispute among the Ulster warriors because they don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. No pun intended. And here, I mean, Alil is, well, in the kind of when the story recapitulates, when we go to the second manuscript and it goes back, it backtracks a bit to before they enter the fortress, and there's no iron house, but Alil is still the one who ushers them in and has them, given food and drink and gets them drunk, but he's not treated as the person who betrays them. It's very unclear. It's very unclear, and we don't have that version's first half. It's not at all clear. I think that's why it gets this. I think this is one of the reasons these elements of the story are picked out for scholarly analysis, but the whole tale is very hard to treat because we don't have one full version, and the two versions they fit together, even internally, have these contradictions that are just, and maybe not meant to be resolved. Maybe this is kind of like a one-off comic story because the story is funny in both versions.
And that to me really stands out as its character. You even see this in the title, The Intoxication of, right? I don't think we're entirely meant to understand this as being a cohesive narrative within any greater cycle of text.
Right.
More just what happens when our silly characters do silly things.
Right.
Particularly when we have these elements of the Tuatha De Danann coming into it.
Yeah.
In particularly the watching from the wall segment, right, where we have the two druids atop of Tever Luachra watching out as these simultaneously comic and otherworldly and martial scenes unfold. It seems comedic relief more than anything else.
Right.
Because they don't know what they're seeing.
But we do know from the description that we get later, these people are scary. Yeah. I mean, if you saw the Ulstermen driving their chariots towards your fort, drunk out of their minds and brandishing their weapons, you would be concerned. Yeah. And I mean, there's the obvious humor, or maybe not obvious, but more apparent humor of what happens when these characters get so drunk that they don't even. I mean, they don't just get lost. Cuchulainn literally drives right by his own home. Like he's blind drunk. I mean, literally. Doesn't recognize it, takes them all the way to the other end of Ireland, the southwest. So that's funny. The two druids, the one just being like, it's a bunch of deer, or it's the woods, or whatever. It's just fog. It's not the breath of these, steaming breath of these angry warriors. The other one saying, no, these are scary people who are coming to attack us. That's funny. But also quite a few examples. And of course, when Triscuth it kills people by looking at them, just by giving them mean looks. It was ugly eyes them. And then to top it, instead of doing it a third time, he just picks one guy up on the arm and swings him around and beats everyone else to death with it. Very Looney Tunes style comedy. But I also like the laconic humor that's present in it. When Cuchulainn comes to Evan Macha to talk to Conchover, yeah, he greets Cuchulainn, he flatters him, oh, you're so wonderful, and so generous and patient and wise, and Cuchulainn's basically like, that's the greeting of somebody looking for a favor, which is great, like little laconic response. Another great one when they end up down in the Southwest. They're describing what's going on. I'd have to look it up exactly, but yeah, that's it. So we get this. One of the more common uses of this laconic humor, I think, right, is where you have this long descriptive passage, right? Or list of names, list of places. In this instance, a list of all the places they go by. And at the end of it, I forget which one of the characters says, "Well, we're sure not in home. We're sure not at home." Basically, it's like, yeah, no kidding. This doesn't look like home. Like, yeah, we've gotten like 150 words in Old Irish giving this crazy root. It's like, oh yeah, I guess we're not here. So that's always a fun one as well. Another keynote that something about this story is meant as a sort of one-off. Conchobar, actually a good king who settles,
yes.
who manages conflict well. He never does that otherwise.
And in juxtaposition within the text to Cuchulainn's wild nature, right? I mean, this is, I think, at least when reading through it, part of the framing of this intoxication bit is Cuchulainn, when given to kingly acts his worst. He's a bad host, insofar as he can't get them from point A to point B. He's not, when we come to the end of the text, someone who brings order to the social unit, which in theory is the core function of kingship. This enables Conchobar to be himself, right? So that's part of the humor. It's what happens to the social unit when you invert people in their typical roles.
Which is really made explicit by, I guess we should talk about, the whole deal that's made to, we have three ulsters in three pieces. Fintan and Cuchulainn agree to give up their third of the province to Conchobar for a year, which is, again, kind of harkening back to the story of how Conchobar became king.
Right, so in the context of the history of the Ulster cycle, Fergus is the main king, right? He's the historic king.
Until Conchobar.
Until Conchobar comes along. And the betrayal of Ulster by Fergus in the Guarantors during the exiles of the Sons of Nishlu results in the passing of the kingship to Conchobar.
Well, the whole reason that Conchobar is able to take the kingship from Fergus isn't... Yeah. Well, first off, this is Fergus's weakness is that he's a very horny man and gives it up
to his passions.
That's a whole other video. But right, he gives up the kingship for a year, just like in the same setup here, but to have the sexual favors of Ness, Conchobar's mother. And the reason that the Ulstermen go at the end of the year go, no, we don't actually want it back to you, is because he gave them up for sexual favors, right? But also things seem to be going rather well in the province, and we have that explicitly in this tale. Like you were saying about Cuchulainn being in his proper place is not a king. The text is very explicit. Like everybody was in their proper social role. Every son was in the role of his father. So that's kind of where that goes. Where I think that all ties together very nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what is happening in a lot of these early Irish stories is the audience has within their mind a conception of how society operates, or the expectations they have as, a farmer in service to a lord. And what the stories enable them to do is play with the different ideas of what happens when we invert certain portions of the social contract. This is to some extent the fantasy of a warrior. I am so great at what I do, make me king. And the text really illustrates that inversion, right? And Conchobar's role consistently is as king within the broader cycle of tales. And so this was really highlighting, through juxtaposition with madness and intoxication, Conchobar's role as good king, right? He can actually bring coherence to the social unit in a way that the rest of the tale does not provide.
Normally, Conchobar is the one who often gives into his base desires, passions, ego, narcissism, you might say. In this case, he's actually able to mediate between two, what could be a potentially disastrous conflict between these two vassals. And again, the feast, just like Ireland is divided in two, the feasting night is divided in two, but has to be done precisely. So Loig is out there, right? Cuchulainn's charioteer is watching the stars. Honestly, kind of expect Cuchulainn to be the one to do that to some degree, because he's always so good at reckoning things.
Yes. But that's part of the point where he suddenly can't do the things he's normally supposed to do. Reckoning time, identifying location, having the mastery of the chariot ride. When he's placed in this role as king, he can't function in his normal capacity. And the consequence is people who aren't equipped for those roles execute them imperfectly.
And I guess yeah, I think if you kind of look at it in that lens, right, we have the rather strange statements, the repeated statements. I think it's in both versions too, that when people say Cuchulainn's not the best warrior, like who's going to get us out of this? Well, Cuchulainn should. He got us into this mess, even though he's not the best warrior.
Right.
Even though the entire rest of the Ulster cycle, except for I guess Macduff's pig and the first one of the versions of the Siege of Howth, I think some of that may be intended to spur him on to heroic action, right? Yeah. That kind of degradation to be like, prove yourself. You did get us into this mess. Now prove yourself by getting us out of it. And it's true that Triscoth, right, Triscothal, I think in the first half, and then probably the same person, Triscoth, in the second half, who is clearly extremely strong, but is not actually able to break them out of the house. Cuchulainn, in both versions, is the one that gets them out of the entrapment of the house. Him in his martial role, he actually is able to excel and to save enough of them anyway. That they consider it a victory in the end, although Conchobar's young son, Fervitha, is killed, who's also his age seems to vary between the two versions, right? He's like a very small child in the first half, and then is old enough to be fighting in the second half.
Well, it does make me wonder within the text if kind of the idea is people are most successful when they're in their proper roles. Conchobar is king, Cuchulainn's hero. What is the role of Fintan? what is this being underscored here for him? Because he just kind of melts into the background of the narrative once the alternation goes back and forth. So it's almost as if they were looking for a figure that could be an elderly individual within society to juxtapose with Cuchulainn's youthful energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see a lot in a lot of these narratives, a sort of similar, a related idea, right? When you have the old king marry the two young women, and it never works out, right? And they're told, you're not going to be a good fit for each other, and it's the same. You, Cuchulainn, the young warrior, are not a good fit for ruling over your third of Ulster. And you, Fintan, you're maybe more elder statesman, you can give good advice or something, but you probably should not be ruling on your own, or you need to be an under king rather than be an independent king. Whereas Conchobar is in his prime and can manage things.
I think it's interesting to also note within the text the inversion of time that takes place, right? Because this night seemingly lasts forever on this wild ride, and long enough for snow to fall and bury the house.
That's true.
Right? And, we can almost see night here, as is paralleled in some of the other stories, early Irish literature, as being this interface between reality and unreality.
And snowfall or fog falling, weather that limits your visibility, and then you're in an unfamiliar, strange place and have to survive is also common.
And especially with the explicit Tuatha Dé elements in this. Other portions of the Ulster cycle, we can kind of read these themes and these kind of temporally liminal settings. But here the text underscores the reality of it being with the Tuatha Dé themselves.
Right.
The inversion of time, the inversion of the weather.
And it occurring at Samhain.
Samhain, yeah. November 1st is not a particularly snowy time in Ireland. It may be elsewhere in the world, but not Ireland, certainly.
Usually not, no. Yeah. Whatever the historical elements of, whatever level of continuity there is between Samhain being an auspicious time in modern tradition and medieval tradition. Like, look, I'm sorry, in these tales, it's very clear. This is a time when the permeability between our world and the other world is clearly weak. It's more permeable. It's weaker, the distinction. I guess that kind of leads us into Cú Roy.
Yes. My favorite guy in this.
Yeah. Cú Curoi McDoida. I guess I'll just say, a little bit about him in general. He's not as common in these stories as Maeve and Alil, but the same way that Maeve and Alil are usually enemies, but sometimes neutral or even, equivalent peers from a separate kingdom to Conchobar and his court. Curoi and Cuchulainn have a particular relationship more than anybody. Right, I don't think the other Ulstermen really interact with Curoi very much, but Cuchulainn kills him in one story, and is one of the things that leads to Cuchulainn's death. But they seem to have some sort of friendship a lot of the time. And I'm not sure that second element, Roy. I'm not sure that that's ever been really well explained. But he's another hound figure in some way, and Curoi also, in genealogically, and it makes it clear here, he's a member of the Doidinne, or the Aiden, like these it gets very complicated in the genealogies, but he is an ancestral figure for people in the southwest of Ireland, in like Cork and Kerry. At the same time, he frequently is a sort of shape-shifting giant. He's frequently described as raiding across the sea, or frequently, not frequently, but other times that Cuchulainn goes to Curoi's fort, which is not where he goes in this story. That's a different place. Curoi is away raiding, plundering somewhere else in the world, or at least that's the story, the cover story. So he's an interesting figure, and he also is very ambiguous. Sometimes friend, sometimes enemy. Here he's more directly an enemy, but also these drunken, violent people have shown up in his house, and but I love that he just says, "Don't worry about it. Their coming has been foretold."
And the kind of the parallels with Cuchulainn too can be emphasized in kind of the monstrous, like corporeally altering capabilities they have, exactly. Right? Cuchulainn very notably becomes monstrous. He lives up to his hound-like characteristics by in frothing in a battle rage, altering his body. We see this again with Curoi. But what's particularly interesting, I think, with Curoi within this tale is why he's there to begin with. Right, yeah. Because Alil and Medivh are going to him because he's going to foster their son. Yeah,
Moinne Mo Epart. Yeah, one of the 7 Moinnes, one of their 7 sons. Yeah,
and this is a very important role within, not just within the Ulster cycle, but within early Irish society writ large. Right, it's the idea that you find these noble fosterages for your children. So he's kind of dragged into the text in this capacity, and is once again a good foil for what's happening with the Ulstermen. They've kind of inverted the nature of their society, right, with this kingship sharing. And this is juxtaposed to the Connachta, Lil and Maeve, who are engaging in what is proper and what is expected. Yeah. So they're, at least within the text, to some extent placed within the socially normative position, emphasized by the watching from the walls, right?
Yes. I mean, although that's interesting too, I can't think of other examples of using druids in this Watchman device.
Right.
It seems, and they're both named Crum, meaning like hunchback.
Yeah.
There's some sort of, I want to be careful with my terminology here, but like they're marked physically as distinct from the rest of the people, basically, in some fashion. In addition to having these magical abilities as druids, and again, their kind of maybe relative smallness may be contrasted with Curoi's gigantic nature. I don't know. You need to look into it more closely, but it is interesting. There's some indications too that, again, as we said, Curoi being somewhat supernatural himself, it's not clear whether he has sort of like a human facing form and an otherworld facing form. That's the impression I get from a lot of these stories. Yeah. And I think that can also explain when Loig must explain to Cuchulainn where they are. Because after Cuchulainn sobers up, he should be able to figure it out. Unless they're in the other world, and as in the wasting sickness of Cuchulainn, he's actually not able to navigate the other world, even though he is himself partly, of the other world with his father Loig. Loig is the one who explicitly is born and seemingly raised by his parents in the other world, comes, and I don't think it's ever explained how he becomes Cuchulainn's charioteer, to be honest. But he serves this sort of scouting role in the other world for Cuchulainn in other stories. So Tevar Luachra is a real place. I'm not sure what the archaeology says about there being a fortress there. Certainly nothing like what's described. There's no iron house. But this may be, again, the snowfall, Cuchulainn not knowing where they are, Curoi. These all may be indications that we're meant to understand this as actually being in the other world. And that's part of the intense danger for the Ulstermen.
Or at least somehow an otherworldly mirror to the real Teverluacra. Because we see this in, for instance, Ectranera, where he is entering an otherworldly version of Rathcruk. It's the same location, but he's not in the real world anymore, and he's doing things in a different time span. And that's kind of what we see here. They're in the real world, but they're not, and things are messed up. I mean, literally Mesca, right? Intoxicated, mixed, altered.
Like even some of the connotation of frenzied sometimes. Yeah. It's interesting that she's present in the first half, the first fragment, and then absent in the second. But Maeve, Medivh's name meaning one who intoxicates, who has the same root element as mead. Well, sure, why not throw her into the story? Yeah. She belongs in the story about getting way too drunk.
I would be honestly inclined to, this is maybe a bit speculative, but the second version, right, the version where she doesn't mainly appear, seems to me to represent something a little more true to the calling of this being an inversion of expectations, because it does just present Alil, and he is just making decisions and doing things on his own.
That's true.
And we shouldn't expect this, right? And maybe in the longer text that we have surviving, where Medivh is present. Yeah. Okay, well, so this was a bridge too far for one version of the text. They had to return some normalcy to it.
It could be okay, do you want to say anything about Dovthach? Dovthach Doyle?
What is there to say about that?
That's tough. Yeah, I guess I'll say a few things about Dovthach Doyle. Or Dole. Yeah. He's present in a number of Ulster Cycle stories as an extraordinarily violent, nasty, child murdering, women murdering person, and everyone basically views him as kind of a monster, really. We have a description of him by the True Druids where he has this cauldron of blood and poison that he has to quench his spear's desire for murder in, which I thought appeared in another text, but I couldn't find it before our discussion. Maybe somebody else had a similar spear. Just to give an idea, basically that he has this spear that is so desired that itself wants to kill so badly that it will kill Dovthach if he does not use it. Right. It's really something like a cursed item out of Dungeons and Dragons. Yes. It's really it's you can see where maybe somebody coming up with some D&D modules was familiar with this thing. He then has the other role of in the second fragment, the part that ends the story, when they go into the house. Yeah. This one not with the iron interior, but when they all get locked in there, he's the one who basically sounds the alarm. He says, well, none of us are going to go home alive. He shows up in the Toyn a few times, Toynbochlunne a few times again, prophesying death. I think he's trampled. He's one of the people trampled by the two bulls at the end. He's very disliked, very hated. Fergus explicitly, and this is the only mention of Fergus in Mesca Ulad, is a reference to him reciting a poem about how awful Dovthach is. But he does serve a useful function in the story by alerting them to their danger, right? In the first fragment, it's because it's the Iron House, they obviously feel themselves being cooked alive. In this one, they are unaware, they're so drunk, they're unaware that the armies of the Aiden, who again, Curoi is now absent from the story, but it is the population group, the tribal group, if you will, that he is associated with, that are the enemy. It sort of points a little bit to why he's tolerated too, because sometimes without doing evolutionary psychology, you need the pessimist, you need the person who's always pointing out the problems and the dangers, and
it's just the outsider, right? Having the outsider within the social unit enables you to do things that other people in good standing cannot.
Which is often the use of Cuchulainn himself.
Yes, and perhaps is another one of these inverted elements here, right?
Yeah.
Cuchulainn is not acting in his normal capacity as literally watchdog.
Yeah.
Instead, this hated man is the one who has to do it instead.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, it's interesting. They do repeat it when they are sort of denigrating Cuchulainn. They do refer to him as a foster son of the Ulstermen. They do point out that he's really not one of them, even though that's enormously useful, especially on Tonbokulnya, which there is reference to in this story, right? As I said, the poem that Fergus recites about Dovthach. But they seem to be treating him in this derogatory outsider fashion, and he has to prove himself, which works out for them in the end. So should we talk about the Iron House?
Yes, the Iron House is very interesting, particularly because its revelation partially to the Ulstermen is comedic. They don't notice it at first because it's sandwiched between two bits of wood. You can kind of conjure in your mind this image of almost cartoonish bits of wood being plastered on top to hide what is obviously a trap for them.
And that it's been prepared well in advance.
Well in advance.
Which again, another indication, maybe there's something more otherworldly going on to the setting that, I mean, it doesn't say who gave the I guess maybe it indicates that the old man who has the chains under his bed that they used to bind, that maybe he's the one who gave the prophecy. But it is interesting. And it's an idea, this hidden house of iron, this trap house, also shows up in the story of Loigra Lork and Lavrith Lingshach, where it's used by a dispossessed king to take revenge on his uncle, who has basically killed his father, sent his brother, the main character's father, and sent this character into exile, and now he comes back and invites him to this feast and kills him in that fashion. There's a reference to a similar iron house in one of the branches of the Mabinogi, the Welsh medieval stories. It's not clear whether, again, it isn't exactly clear. It can't be determined definitively that the element in that Welsh story comes from Irish storytelling, or if the Irish trope comes from Welsh, or if they share a common ancestor way, way, way back in storytelling, the origins of these tales.
But it's a convenient plot device to have, right? Like the idea of an impregnable structure. Yeah. And, I mean, you see this plenty in, my favorite genre of film being Westerns, right? Mm-hmm. Like the turning point in narratives is when the hero gets thrown into jail, right? A literal modern iron house in that capacity. In the threat of being bound by hospitality, essentially being your demise, is an important trope.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a fun, but I think kind of trying to locate the origin of this trope, this motif of the Iron House, definitively either in Irish or Welsh storytelling, or even in a common, insular Celtic story, whatever, is kind of misses the point. To some degree, part of it is that when you're invited to the feast of your enemies to reconcile, things can still go wrong. That's a real situation. That's a dangerous situation that people will be familiar with. There's also certainly in many, many Norse tales the issues of hall burnings, right? Which I think you can't ignore, as this is also part of it. I think that's in the second fragment, which doesn't have the Iron House. The implication seems to be, it's very much like in the Norse sagas, where people the people trying to burn people alive gather outside and they form a ring so that people who escape the house are still killed. And that seems to be what the Eowyn are setting up to do to the Ulstermen, which is why it's imperative they act quickly. And then even much further afield, and again, I don't think genetically related in terms of storytelling genes, but is the lacquer house in the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, where again a special house is prepared. There's a invitation of hospitality. Again, they're also in exile, the five Pandavas at this time. They're not at home. It's not the exact same situation, but they're outside their home territory. They're invited in. They recognize they're like, wait a minute. This thing has been lacquered, so it'll be just go up like that, and we will burn alive. their solution to it, again, and it is interesting that just like in this one, there's an underground chamber. In this case, it's the part of the trap. In the Indian story, they hire a tunneler before to dig a passage that they can just basically go down a trap door, put 5 corpses they've stolen from a graveyard into the beds, or 6 actually, because they need one for their mother too, and then they escape that way. So this is a widespread fear of being burned alive in an enemy who invites you in, and whatever the exact origins of this are. But I love the Iron House motif because the horror of being cooked alive and every surface is burning you is visceral. I mean, it's
utterly horrifying. And the fact that it's iron too works very well for them being outside of their normal context, right? They're foreigners. They're in maybe an otherworldly setting, as we've discussed, but they're certainly not at home. They're outside of Ulster. And what's more fantastical than a house made entirely of iron?
Yeah.
Especially in the early medieval period.
Yeah, I'm not a huge expert on ironworking archaeology in Ireland, but from presentations I've seen, I mean, silverwork in Ireland, sure, phenomenal, like truly world class, incredible, like everyone amazed by. The ironwork, though, very low grade. I mean, these are like the swords they're using are sort of cast iron often. I mean, they have no carbonization, very little carbonization, sometimes along the edge. It's all, anyway, we don't need to get into all of that, but just to say the idea of being able to build, like, this is technologically, this is like science fiction almost. How impossible it would be. Even the house with entirely planked wood, I don't think that would be realistic either. Like even feasting halls built for a specific purpose as sort of vaulted roofs and stuff would not have this kind of planked siding, I don't think.
No. I mean, my understanding is, if we're viewing this as reflecting a notion of houses and halls prior to the Viking arrival, we should envision entirely circular structures that are mostly woven and thatched, and mix of like wattle and daub on the woven walls. We're not envisioning something that is planked wood. And even when we're in a context where halls in a true Viking sense are present in Ireland, again, it's not energy efficient for the type of trees that are growing in these lowland environments for you to be doing large timbered planked structures. Yeah. So no matter how you slice it,
I think there's some
building is unusual.
Yeah. I do think there's some indication that maybe for these feasting halls, they were temporary structures. So we might envision something more like an actual like wooden plinths holding up. Yes. So it wouldn't, maybe these would be long, rather than circular, but certainly not fully enclosed, and they wouldn't be able to cover up an iron interior. In any event, it is science fiction, even within their realities. So we don't need to get too much into. We don't need to rack our brains over how this would be realized. I want to talk about the ending. I guess to lead into a discussion of the ending of the story, right? Because there's a sort of epilogue, right? There's 2 epilogues actually. The first epilogue about the satirist Riches, the female satirist who wants to take vengeance on Cuchulainn, and Crofton Nianoir, who also wants to take vengeance on Cuchulainn at the end of the story. It does tie back. Riches, as a woman satirist, she's not the only one in the story. Right. And in fact, the counter invitation to Conchobar's feast is instigated by Leverham, who is the female satirist at Conchobar's court. Yes. And she has, and again, it's interesting that they mention the sons of Ishlu at least twice in this story, when she is the Leverham, the female satirist, is the one who kind of instigates Nishu, one of the sons of Ishlu, running off with Deirdre in that story. She's the one who is caretaking Deirdre as she grows up to become Conchobar's concubine. Again, this is, like we said, Conchobar normally really rotten as a king and as a person. Leverham known to kind of cause issues, especially for Conchobar. So it's interesting that he sends her, but it's almost like, again, like you were saying, that he is in his proper social function for a change, or he executes it well, that he knows he needs somebody who will actually not just deliver a polite invitation, but somehow kind of almost trick or prod Cuchulainn into doing it.
Induces action, right? I mean, and she's agentive. That's what's interesting about her in her other text, is that she does things, and she is the moment of action within this tale as well. But also the fact that the tale ends with this female satirist inducing action on the part of Cuchulainn, or it actually the opposite, in fact, right? Like initially paralysis, really does frame the text in likely an unintended but nonetheless poetic way.
They don't mention like the debility of the Ulsterman, which is its own other complicated topic, but the thing that incapacitates the Ulsterman during Táin Bó Cúailnge, during the cattle raid of Cooley, Cuchulainn is not affected because he's not genetically part of the Ulsterman. They make mention, as we talked about, that Cuchulainn is like their foster son. He's not my nephew. He's not my sister's son. Although actually he's Conchobar's sister's son. I think, and again, you would need to compare the Old Irish directly, but Cuchulainn as a child isn't able to, is sort of made bashful and looks away and sort of defanged a little bit by naked women showing themselves. In this case, though, it seems to go a little bit further than him just having to look away. I mean, he seems actually physically on the ground and capable of getting up. It's almost like the debility of the Ulsterman, which I just found interesting. And then Loig, in the role of Cuchulainn in the Táin, rescuing him from this debility, right? And doing it in a way that does kind of make you think of Cuchulainn using the guy Bolga in the Táin, because he shoots the slingstone up Rich's ass and then rips out her guts and breaks her back that way. Which is not uncommon, use of the sling sometimes, but I don't think Loig normally bears weapons at all.
No, normally, I mean, Cuchulainn, for his part, is very well known for his slings and his stone and his throwing. So, again, we have inversion once more. Loig is acting as Cuchulainn. Yeah. Cuchulainn is acting as not himself, but the people he normally protects, inhabiting this debilitation in the face of an enemy. And the fact that his enemy is a woman is particularly interesting because, again, it draws his connections to his youth. He shouldn't, in theory, be a youth in this text because he's a king, but nonetheless, his youthfulness, whether it's in juxtaposition with Conchobar in Fintan, or whether it is here, right, manifesting his trope of boyhood, really is inescapable. He is not himself, and that seems to be the point of the tale.
Yeah, and it also kind of... There's almost some foreshadowing here, too, where a female satirist and a young warrior want to take vengeance on Cuchulainn. And this really calls forward to his death tale, and how eventually Cuchulainn is such a great warrior, he's killed so many people that eventually they get together and are like, this guy's got to go. We've all lost our fathers, our sons, whatever, and we've got to get rid of this guy. It's interesting, though, so just kind of, if we can round out the tale, it begins with this theme of division, right? We're dividing all of Ireland, then we're dividing Ulster, then we're dividing the feast, and then there's a kind of reintegration, right?
Yes.
That ends with, and like you said about Fintan being kind of a non-entity, it ends with the feast, they end with the feast at Cuchulainn's fortress at Dundalgan, but also not just that, but that Ailill's friendship with the Ulstermen is also recapitulated at the end. They don't kill him at the fort after their victory because they're not at war with him, even though he led them into the house. Which is, but then on top of it, this sort of reintegration between two rival kingdoms, almost like sort of the way that the Tuatha De Danann are there to create strife between the humans, but there's actually friendship between these two kingdoms, enough that one can come visit and leave with gifts.
But it's importantly a friendship and a unification between these two kingdoms born on the back that Ulster is reunited, right?
Yeah.
It's no longer divided. Its proper rule under Conchobar has been restored, and therefore it has the capacity to do what it could never do in its division, which is to show friendliness and magnanimity for their historic enemies, or at least their thematic enemies.
They're enemies in the sagas, if not historically.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which I do want to make actually a quick point about that, because the when it gives the description of which section of Ulster the three kings rule, right? And it says explicitly this was the time of Ulster's greatest extent. And actually, no, in other parts of the Ulster cycle, Ulster is significantly bigger than the territory they seem to be describing. It's not entirely clear, but it seems to only be describing like basically more or less modern day Antrim, Derry, not Derry actually, no, Antrim, Down, Louth, and Armagh. So basically East Ulster. But what's now Derry and Fermanagh, which is often part of the king, and much less Donegal, are completely. It just says no. The greatest extent was actually what we think in historical terms was the greatest extent of the people who claimed descent from the Ulstermen.
Right, like within early medieval society, this is the portion of Northern Ireland that becomes the epicenter for the province of Ulster, but more really the settlement of the Irish polity on both sides of the waters that separate Ireland and Scotland. This is the heyday of the Dal Riada,
right?
Who are mainly concentrated in modern-day Hebrides. And we see this a bit in Conchover being said to be the descendant of the kings of Ireland and Britain.
Right.
Is that's probably what's underlying this, right? This notion that Ulster's greatest extent within the sagas happens to actually be the territory of the Dal Riada and its closest allies within Northern Ireland itself. And that's really this territory pushed up against County Down and its surrounding regions.
Right. It may be kind of more referencing a more historical situation, which would still be quite a couple hundred years, at least a few hundred years in the past when this was written. But the idea that, yes, when the Ulstermen, their historic descendants, or the people who claim descent from these semi-mythical figures, had their greatest extent, if you count both their territory in Ireland and in Scotland. Which, again, could be also an interesting idea of a division between the kingdom of the Ulstermen, because it's physically separated by the water, even if water is not always a barrier to, as much of a barrier as, say, forest and bog, in practical terms, yeah. All right. I mean, I think we've gone over this. I think we've beaten this to death without actually writing a paper on it. I don't have anything else to add on this one. All right. Well, thanks so much again for joining me for this. It's been fun, and we hope you'll join us again. Joe's going to be with me for a few more tales in this recording session. Will be posted separately. I'm not sure when they'll go live, but yeah, we'll pick up somewhere else. So hope to see you there. Thanks again.